Ruth, Chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth by Elizabeth Gaitskell. Chapter 2. Ruth goes to the Shire-hall. In due time that evening, Mrs. Mason collected her young ladies for an inspection of their appearance before proceeding to the Shire-hall. Her eager, important, hurried manner of summoning them was not unlike that of a hen clucking her chickens together, and, to judge from the close investigation they had to undergo, it might have been thought that their part in the evening's performance was to be far more important than that of temporary ladies' maids. "Is that your best frock, Miss Hilton?" asked Mrs. Mason, in a half dissatisfied tone, turning Ruth about, for it was only her Sunday black silk, and was somewhat worn and shabby. "Yes, ma'am," answered Ruth quietly. "Oh, indeed! Then it will do." Still the half-satisfied tone. "Dress, young lady, you know, is a very secondary consideration. Conduct is everything. Still, Miss Hilton, I think you should write and ask your guardian to send you some money for another gown. I am sorry I did not think of it before." "I do not think he would send any if I wrote," answered Ruth, in a low voice. "He was angry when I wanted a shawl, when the cold weather set in." Mrs. Mason gave her a little push of dismissal, and Ruth fell into the ranks by her friend, Miss Wood. "Never mind, Ruthie, you're prettier than any of them," said a merry, good-natured girl, whose plainness excluded her from any of the envy of rivalry. "Yes, I know I am pretty," said Ruth sadly, "but I am sorry I have no better gown, for this is very shabby. I am ashamed of it myself, and I can see Mrs. Mason is twice as much ashamed. I wish I need not go. I did not know we should have to think about our own dress at all, or I should not have wished to go." "Never mind, Ruth," said Jenny. "You have been looked at now, and Mrs. Mason will soon be too busy to think about you and your gown." "Did you hear Ruth Hilton say she knew she was pretty?" whispered one girl to another, so loudly that Ruth caught the words. "I could not help knowing," answered she simply, "for many people have told me so." At length these preliminaries were over, and they were walking briskly through the frosty air. The free motion was so inspiring that Ruth almost danced along, and quite forgot all about shabby gowns and grumbling guardians. The Shire-hall was even more striking than she had expected. The sides of the staircase were painted with figures that showed ghostly in the dim light, for only their faces looked out of the dark, dingy canvas, with a strange fixed stare of expression. The young milliners had to arrange their wares on tables in the anteroom, and make all ready before they could venture to peep into the hall room, where the musicians were already tuning their instruments, and where one or two charwomen (strange contrast with their dirty loose attire and their incessant chatter to the grand echoes of the vaulted room) were completing the dusting of benches and chairs. They quitted the place as Ruth and her companions entered. They had talked lightly and merrily in the anteroom, but now their voices were hushed, awed by the old magnificence of the vast apartment. It was so large that objects showed dim at the further end, as through a mist. Full-length figures of county worthies hung around, in all varieties of costume from the days of Holbein to the present time. The lofty roof was indistinct, for the lamps were not fully lighted yet, while through the richly painted Gothic window at one end the moonbeams fell, many tinted, on the floor, and mocked with their vividness the struggles of the artificial light to illuminate its little sphere. High above sounded the musicians, fitfully trying some strain of which they were not certain. Then they stopped playing and talked, and their voices sounded goblin-like in their dark recess, where candles were carried about in an uncertain wavering manner, reminding Ruth of the flickering zigzag motion of the will-o'-the-wisp. Suddenly the room sprang into the full blaze of light, and Ruth felt less impressed with its appearance, and more willing to obey Mrs. Mason's sharp summons to her wandering flock, than she had been when it was dim and mysterious. They had presently enough to do in rendering offices of assistance to the ladies who thronged in, and whose voices drowned all the muffled sound of the band Ruth had longed so much to hear. Still, if one pleasure was less, another was greater than she had anticipated. On condition of such a number of little observances that Ruth thought Mrs. Mason would never have ended enumerating them, they were allowed during the dances to stand at a side door and watch. And what a beautiful sight it was, floating away to that bounding music, now far away, like garlands of fairies, now near, and showing as lovely women, with every ornament of graceful dress, the elite of the county danced on, little caring whose eyes gazed and were dazzled. Outside all was cold and colourless and uniform, one coating of snow over all. But inside it was warm and glowing and vivid. Flowers scented the air, and wreathed the head and rested on the bosom as if it were midsummer. Bright colours flashed on the eye and were gone, and succeeded by others as lovely in the rapid movement of the dance. Smiles dimpled every face, and low tones of happiness murmured indistinctly through the room in every pause of the music. Ruth did not care to separate figures that formed a joyous and brilliant whole. It was enough to gaze, and the dream of the happy smoothness of the lives in which such music, and such profusion of flowers, of jewels, elegance of every description, and beauty of all shapes and hues, were everyday things. She did not want to know who the people were, although to hear a catalogue of names seemed to be the great delight of most of her companions. In fact, the enumeration rather disturbed her, and, to avoid the shock of too rapid a descent into the commonplace world of Miss Smiths and Mr. Thompsons, she returned to her post in the anteroom. There she stood, thinking or dreaming. She was startled back to actual life by a voice close to her. One of the dancing young ladies had met with a misfortune. Her dress, of some gossamer material, had been looped up by nosegays of flowers, and one of these had fallen off in the dance, leaving her gown to trail. To repair this, she had begged her partner to bring her to the room where the assistants should have been. None were there but Ruth. "Shall I leave you?" asked the gentleman. "Is my absence necessary?" "Oh, no," replied the lady. "A few stitches will set all to rights. Besides, I dare not enter that room by myself." So far she spoke sweetly and prettily, but now she addressed Ruth. "Make haste. Don't keep me an hour." And her voice became cold and authoritative. She was very pretty, with long dark ringlets and sparkling black eyes. These had struck Ruth in the hasty glance she had taken before she knelt down to her task. She also saw that the gentleman was young and elegant. "Oh, that lovely galop! How I long to dance to it! Will it never be done? What a frightful time you are taking, and I'm dying to return in time for this galop." By way of showing a pretty childlike impatience, she began to beat time with her feet to the spirited air the band was playing. Ruth